January 22nd, 1887, Montana Territory. The thermometer outside reads -40 degrees Fahrenheit, but inside Elizabeth Anderson's cabin, her two daughters are sitting at the kitchen table in cotton dresses, working on their lessons. No coats, no shawls, just the quiet hum of warmth wrapping around them like an invisible blanket. 70 degrees. 300 yards down the valley, her nearest neighbor, William Garrett, is on his knees in front of his iron stove, feeding it split logs every 20 minutes, watching his breath fog in the air inside his own home. His children are huddled under wool blankets, coughing. His wife has frostbite on her fingers from trying to cook breakfast. The wind screams through the gaps in their plank walls like a living thing, hungry and cruel. William built his home the way every other settler in the valley did. Good Montana pine, 2-inch planks, tight joints. He paid a carpenter from Helena $45 to make sure everything was square and true. He followed the advice of Captain Robert Thornton, the Army engineer stationed at Fort Benton, who had designed barracks for soldiers across the frontier. Captain Thornton said thick timber was the answer. William believed him. Elizabeth Anderson built her home with garbage. That is what everyone said. Pine needles, sawdust, moss, stuffed between two thin walls of rough-cut lumber. It looked like a joke. It looked like something a desperate, foolish widow would throw together because she could not afford proper materials. But tonight, while the blizzard of 1887 tears across the valley with winds that hit 70 miles per hour and a wind chill that plunges to -60 degrees, Elizabeth's cabin stands silent and warm. And William Garrett, proud William, who called her a fool 6 months ago, is about to knock on her door and beg for help. This is the story of how one woman, armed with nothing but Swedish folk wisdom and a stubborn refusal to die, beat the richest, most educated men in Montana Territory at their own game. And she did it with trash. Let me take you back. Back to the summer of 1886, when Elizabeth first arrived in the valley and no one thought she would survive the winter. Elizabeth Anderson stepped off the stagecoach in Silverbow on July 3, 1886, with $11.30 in her pocket, 2 frightened daughters clutching her skirts, and a letter from a cousin she had never met who said there was unclaimed land near the Boulder River if she was willing to work for it. Her husband, Carl, had died 4 months earlier in a mine collapse in northern Wisconsin. The mining company paid her $60 in compensation and told her to leave the company housing within 2 weeks. She had no family left in Wisconsin, no prospects. Just a memory of her father, a Swedish immigrant, telling her stories about how his people survived the long dark winters of Lapland, where the cold could kill you in minutes if you did not respect it. She filed a homestead claim on August 12, 1886. 160 acres of grassland and pine forest, 7 miles from the nearest town. The land office clerk, a thin man with spectacles, looked at her like she was signing her own death warrant. "Ma'am," he said, "you understand you got to build a dwelling and prove up the land. Winter comes early here. Real early." "I understand," Elizabeth said. "You got money for lumber? A crew?" "I will manage." The clerk shook his head and stamped her papers. By August 20th she had cleared a flat spot near a creek and laid a foundation of river stones. By August 25th she had purchased 200 board feet of rough-sawn pine from a mill in Boulder for $9. That left her with $2.30. Not enough for a proper house, not even close. That is when the neighbors started to notice her. And that is when the mockery began. William Garrett was the first to visit. He rode up on a tall bay horse, dismounted, and stood with his arms crossed, watching Elizabeth and her 12-year-old daughter, Anna, digging a trench around the foundation. "You Elizabeth Anderson?" he asked. "I am." "You planning to build a house with that?" He pointed at the small pile of lumber. "Yes." He laughed. Not a mean laugh, but a laugh of disbelief. "Ma'am, that ain't even enough to frame out a chicken coop. You need at least 1,000 board feet for a cabin that will keep you alive through winter. And you need it thick, 2 inches minimum." Elizabeth straightened up, wiping dirt from her hands. "I have what I have." "Then you better pray for a mild winter, because what you got there will not keep you warm when it hits 20 below." "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Garrett." He shook his head and rode away. 2 weeks later, Captain Robert Thornton came by. He was a tall man with a grey beard and a chest full of medals from the Indian Wars. He had designed military structures across the West and considered himself an expert on frontier architecture. He watched Elizabeth nailing together a frame made of thin, 1-inch boards spaced 3 feet apart. Between the boards, she was building a second wall, also 1 inch thick, creating a gap of about 10 inches. "What in God's name are you doing?" Thornton asked. "Building a wall," Elizabeth said. "That is not a wall. That is 2 walls with nothing between them. It will collapse under snow load. And even if it doesn't, cold air will flow through that gap like water through a sieve." "I am going to fill the gap," Elizabeth said. "Fill it with what? You cannot afford brick. You cannot afford stone." "Pine needles," Elizabeth said, "and sawdust." Thornton stared at her. Then he laughed. It was a hard, sharp laugh. "Pine needles. You are going to insulate your home with pine needles?" "Yes." "Ma'am, I have built barracks in Dakota Territory that housed 200 men through winters that killed cattle by the thousands. I know what works. Solid timber. Thick. No gaps. What you are building is a death trap." "Thank you for your advice, Captain." "Advice?" He shook his head. "Lady, I'm trying to save your life. You and those girls will freeze to death in that thing before Christmas. Mark my words." He rode away, shaking his head. The third visitor was Pastor Friedrich Müller, a German immigrant who led the Lutheran Church in Boulder. He was a kind man, but he believed suffering was a test from God, and that those who struggled often did so because they had strayed from righteous paths. He arrived on a Sunday afternoon with a basket of bread and preserves. "Elizabeth," he said gently, "I have heard what you are building. I have heard you are filling your walls with forest scraps." "That is correct. My child, pride is a sin. If you need help, the congregation can provide it. We can organize a barn raising. We can loan you funds for proper materials." "I do not need charity, Pastor. This is not charity. This is Christian love. I am grateful, but I will build my home my way." Pastor Muller's face darkened. "You are a widow with 2 children. You have no husband to guide you. You have no experience. You are building something that defies all common sense, and you are doing it out of stubbornness, not wisdom." Elizabeth met his eyes. "My father survived winters in Sweden that would kill every man in this valley. He taught me how to live when you have nothing. I am following his teachings. Your father is not here, and Sweden is not Montana." "Cold is cold, Pastor." He left the basket and rode away, shaking his head like the others. That night, Elizabeth sat by the fire with her daughters and told them the story her father had told her when she was young. In the north of Sweden, in the land of the Sami people, winters lasted 9 months. Temperatures dropped to 40, even 50 below zero. Timber was scarce, so the people learned to work with what they had. They built double walls. Thin walls because thin wood was easier to find and easier to work. But between those walls, they packed anything that would trap air, moss, lichen, dried grass, even animal fur. Because they understood a secret that the American engineers did not. Air is the best insulator in the world. Not wood, not brick. Air. But only if you can trap it. Keep it still. If air moves, it carries heat away. But if you can trap air in 1,000,000 tiny pockets, it becomes a barrier that cold cannot cross. That is what the pine needles would do. Each needle, each fragment of sawdust, would create a tiny pocket of trapped air. Thousands of pockets, millions, a forest of stillness between her and the cold. Elizabeth did not know the scientific term. She did not know that engineers would later call this R-value, or that they would measure the resistance of materials to heat flow in units named after some British scientist. She just knew it worked, and she knew that if she did not finish before the first snow, her daughters would die. If you believe that practical wisdom is worth more than empty opinions, subscribe now. We are documenting the survival skills that history tried to forget. September 1886 was a race against time. Elizabeth worked from dawn until her hands bled. She cut and nailed and sawed until her shoulders screamed and her back felt like it would snap. Anna, her 12-year-old, worked beside her, hammering nails and hauling boards. Her younger daughter, Clara, only 8, gathered pine needles from the forest floor, stuffing them into burlap sacks until her arms were covered in scratches. The work was brutal. Each wall required 2 layers. The outer layer was 1-inch rough-cut pine, nailed vertically to a simple frame. The inner layer was the same, but the gap between them, that 10-inch gap, had to be packed tight, perfectly tight. No air pockets big enough for convection currents to form. Elizabeth started with the north wall, the wall that would face the worst winds. She nailed the outer layer first, then began stuffing the gap from the top. She used a long stick to push the pine needles down, compressing them, making sure there were no voids. She mixed in sawdust from the mill, dry and powdery, to fill the smaller gaps. She added moss from the creek bank, damp and spongy, which would dry into a dense mat. It took her 4 days to pack one wall. William Garrett rode by on the second day and saw her cramming handfuls of forest debris into the gap. He stopped and watched for a moment, then shook his head and rode on without saying a word. Captain Thornton rode by on the 5th day. He saw the completed north wall, the inner layer nailed shut, the surface rough and uneven. He called out to her. "How much weight do you think that will hold?" he asked. "Enough," Elizabeth said. "You have no engineering knowledge, no training. You are building based on folk tales and desperation. When the snow piles up on that roof, the whole structure will collapse inward." Elizabeth wiped sweat from her face. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but I am too tired to argue." "I am not arguing. I am telling you the truth. And the truth is that you are going to kill yourself and those girls." Elizabeth turned back to her work without answering. That night, alone by the fire, she let herself feel the fear. What if they were right? What if she was a fool? What if her father's stories were just stories, and the American way was the only way that worked in this brutal land? She looked at her daughters, asleep on a pile of blankets near the fire, and she made a choice. She had no other option. She could not afford to build a conventional house. She could not afford to fail, so she would finish what she started, and if she died, at least she would die fighting. By October 15th, the walls were complete, all 4 sides. The roof was simple, steeply pitched to shed snow, covered in hand-split shingles. The door was thick pine, fitted tight into the frame, with wool blankets nailed to the inside for extra insulation. The windows were the biggest challenge. Glass was expensive. Elizabeth could only afford 2 small panes, each 12 inches square. She installed them on the south wall to catch the winter sun. The other walls had no windows at all. Inside, the cabin was small. 1 room, 16 feet by 20 feet. A cast-iron stove in the center, vented through the roof. A sleeping loft for the girls, built above the main room where the heat would rise and collect. A small table, 2 benches, a shelf for their few possessions. It looked ugly from the outside. The walls were rough, the wood unfinished, the whole structure leaning slightly to the east because Elizabeth had not been able to level the foundation perfectly. It looked like something built by someone who did not know what they were doing. But inside, when Elizabeth closed the door and lit a fire in the stove, something remarkable happened. The warmth did not escape. In a normal cabin with solid plank walls, heat radiates outward through the wood into the cold air outside. The wood conducts the heat away, like a metal spoon in a hot cup of coffee. The thicker the wood, the longer it takes, but the heat still escapes. But in Elizabeth's cabin, the heat hit the inner wall and stopped. It could not move through the pine needles. The needles were terrible conductors. The trapped air between them was even worse. The heat had nowhere to go. It bounced back into the room, circulating, building, until the entire space was warm. Elizabeth did not know the physics term for this. She did not know that she had created a high R-value barrier, or that the R-value of loose pine needles and sawdust was somewhere around R3 per inch, giving her walls an effective insulation value of R30. She just knew that it worked. On October 22nd, the first frost came. Temperatures dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Elizabeth lit the stove at dawn and fed it a small amount of wood. By midday, the cabin was 70 degrees inside. She kept the fire burning low all day, using only a third of the wood she had expected to need. That night, she let the fire die down to coals. The temperature outside dropped to 12 degrees. Inside, the cabin stayed at 62 degrees until morning. Elizabeth stood in the center of the room in her cotton dress, no shawl, no coat, and felt the warmth around her like a miracle. Her daughters were warm. They were safe. She had done it. But the neighbors did not believe it, not yet. William Garrett stopped by in early November. The temperature was hovering around 25 degrees, and he was already complaining about how much wood he was burning. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Well," Elizabeth said. "You keeping warm?" "Yes." "You must be burning through a cord of wood a week." "No," Elizabeth said. "Less than a quarter cord." Garrett stared at her. "That is impossible. Come inside and see." He hesitated, then followed her through the door. The moment he stepped inside, he stopped. The warmth hit him like a physical thing. It was at least 65 degrees inside, maybe warmer. The stove was burning low, just a few coals glowing orange in the firebox. "How?" he asked. Elizabeth pointed at the walls. "The needles trap the heat." Garrett walked over and pressed his hand against the inner wall. It was cool to the touch, not cold, but cool. The heat was not escaping through it. He shook his head. "This does not make sense." "It makes perfect sense," Elizabeth said. "Heat cannot move through trapped air. My father taught me that." Garrett stood there for a long moment, staring at the walls like they were some kind of magic trick. Then he turned and walked out without another word. He did not apologize. He did not admit he was wrong. But Elizabeth saw the look in his eyes. Doubt. December came, and the real cold arrived. By December 10th, the temperature had dropped to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. By December 18th, it was 10 below. The wind howled down from the mountains, cutting through the valley like a blade. William Garrett was chopping wood 10 hours a day. His hands were blistered and raw. His back ached from swinging the axe. His children were sick, coughing through the night. His wife had wrapped them in every blanket they owned, but the cold still crept through the walls of their solid plank cabin, drafting through the invisible gaps around the door and windows, stealing the heat faster than the stove could produce it. He burned a full cord of wood every 5 days. Captain Thornton, living in a well-built log home near Boulder, fared better. His walls were thick, made of 8-inch logs, chinked with clay and moss. But even his home was cold. The logs conducted heat outward, slowly but steadily. He kept 2 stoves burning, one in the main room and one in the bedroom, and still he wore a wool coat indoors. He burned a cord of wood every week. Pastor Muller, living in a small house behind the church, suffered the most. His walls were thin planks with no insulation at all. The wind whistled through gaps he could not find, no matter how much oakum he stuffed into the cracks. He wore 3 layers of clothing indoors and still shivered. His breath fogged in the air when he said grace over supper. He burned a cord of wood every 4 days, and Elizabeth Anderson, in her garbage cabin with her pine needle walls, burned a quarter cord every 2 weeks. She woke in the mornings without frost on the inside of the windows. She cooked breakfast without wearing gloves. Her daughters played on the floor in cotton dresses, laughing, healthy, warm. At night, she let the fire burn down to coals, and the cabin stayed at 60 degrees until dawn. The walls held the heat like a battery, releasing it slowly, evenly, through the long, dark hours. The secret, she realized, was not just the insulation. It was the thermal mass. The stove heated the air. The air heated the inner walls. The inner walls, made of wood, held that heat and radiated it back slowly. The pine needles prevented the heat from escaping. The system was a loop, a cycle, a balance between storing heat and trapping it. Elizabeth did not have the words to explain it, but she understood it in her bones. She had built a living thing, a house that breathed and held and gave back. And when the temperature dropped to 20 below on Christmas Eve, and William Garrett's children were crying from the cold, and Captain Thornton was running out of firewood, and Pastor Muller was praying for an early spring, Elizabeth Anderson sat by her stove with her daughters, roasting chestnuts and telling stories. Warm, comfortable, alive. And then January came, and with it, the storm. The blizzard of January 1887 is still remembered in Montana Territory as the White Death. It was part of a larger weather system that devastated the Great Plains, killing thousands of cattle and dozens of settlers. But in the Boulder River Valley, it hit with a fury that no one had ever seen. The storm began on the morning of January 21st. The temperature was already 15 below zero. By noon, the wind had picked up, gusting to 40 miles per hour. By evening, it was a full whiteout. Visibility dropped to zero. The wind hit 70 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally, piling drifts 10 feet high in minutes. The temperature dropped to negative 30 degrees. The wind chill hit negative 60. This was not cold. This was death. William Garrett had prepared as best he could. He had stacked wood inside his cabin, enough for 3 days. He had sealed every crack he could find with strips of cloth and old blankets. He had moved his family into the main room, abandoning the bedrooms to the cold, and kept the stove roaring. But it was not enough. The wind found every gap, every imperfection in his walls. Cold air poured in like water through a cracked dam. The stove could not keep up. He fed it log after log, watching the flames roar, but the heat was sucked away before it could fill the room. By midnight on the first night, the temperature inside his cabin had dropped to 30 degrees. His children were huddled under piles of blankets, shivering uncontrollably. His wife was crying, her hands blue with cold. By dawn on the second day, the temperature inside was 20 degrees. Frost covered the inside of the walls. Ice formed on the water bucket. The stove was still burning, consuming wood at a terrifying rate, but it was losing the battle. William knew they were going to die. Captain Thornton fared no better. His thick log walls, his pride and joy were failing. The logs conducted cold inward, stealing heat from the room. The chinked gaps between the logs, packed with clay and moss, cracked and shrieked in the wind. Cold air whistled through, invisible, unstoppable. He burned both stoves as hot as they would go. He burned furniture. He burned books. He burned the wooden handle of his shovel, and still the cold crept in. By the morning of January 23rd, the temperature inside his home was 25 degrees. His breath fogged in thick clouds. His fingers were numb. He could not stop shaking. He was an army engineer. He had survived campaigns in the Dakotas, in Wyoming, in New Mexico. He had built structures that housed hundreds of men. He had designed fortifications that withstood cannon fire, and now he was going to freeze to death in his own home because he did not understand how heat worked. Pastor Mueller gave up on the second night. His woodpile was nearly gone. The wind had torn a section of his roof loose, and snow was blowing into the attic. The temperature inside his house was 18 degrees. He wrapped himself in every blanket he owned, knelt by his bed, and prayed for salvation. And then he thought of Elizabeth Anderson, the widow, the fool, the woman with the garbage walls. He stood, pulled on his coat, and walked out into the storm. Elizabeth heard the knock over the howl of the wind. She opened the door and found Pastor Mueller standing there, covered in snow, his face grey, his lips blue. "Help me," he whispered. She pulled him inside. The warmth hit him like a hammer. He gasped, his lungs burning from the sudden change. His legs buckled, and Elizabeth caught him, guiding him to a bench near the stove. "Stay here," she said. "I will get you water." He sat there, shaking, staring at the walls. It was 70 degrees inside the cabin. 70 degrees. Outside, the wind was screaming at -60. And inside this garbage shack, this insult to engineering and common sense, it was warm, comfortable, safe. He started to cry. An hour later, there was another knock. This time it was Captain Thornton. He looked like a ghost. His beard was crusted with ice. His hands were so cold he could barely make a fist. "Please," he said. Elizabeth let him in. He stood just inside the door, trembling, staring at the room like he could not believe what he was seeing. The warmth, the comfort, the quiet. "How?" he whispered. "Sit," Elizabeth said. "We can talk later." He sat next to Pastor Mueller. Neither man spoke. They just sat there, thawing, feeling their fingers and toes burn as the circulation returned. At dawn on January 24th, there was a third knock. This time it was William Garrett. He was carrying his youngest daughter, wrapped in blankets, her face pale and still. His wife and other children were behind him, stumbling through the snow. "She is dying," William said, his voice breaking. "Please." Elizabeth took the child from his arms and laid her by the stove, wrapping her in warm blankets, rubbing her hands and feet to bring back the circulation. The girl's breath was shallow, her skin cold as marble. "She will live," Elizabeth said, "but you need to bring the others inside, all of you, now." William stared at her. This woman he had mocked, this woman he had called a fool. "I am sorry," he said. "Save your apologies," Elizabeth said. "Help me save your family." And for 3 days, 12 people sheltered in Elizabeth Anderson's 16 by 20 cabin. They slept on the floor, packed together like cordwood. They shared what little food they had. They burned Elizabeth's carefully hoarded supply of firewood, feeding the stove in small, measured amounts. And the cabin stayed warm. 70 degrees. The walls held. The pine needles and sawdust and moss did their job, trapping the heat, refusing to let the cold inside. The storm raged outside, but inside there was warmth. There was life. William Garrett sat against the wall, watching his children sleep, warm and safe, and he wept. Not from cold this time, from shame. Captain Thornton stood by the inner wall, pressing his hand against it, feeling the cool surface, trying to understand how something so simple, so cheap, so beneath his notice, could work better than everything he had ever built. Pastor Mueller knelt by the stove and prayed, but this time his prayer was not for salvation. It was for forgiveness. Forgiveness for his arrogance. For his certainty that he knew better than this quiet widow who had survived by listening to the wisdom of people he had never met. On January 27th, the storm broke. The wind died. The snow stopped. The temperature began to climb, slowly, back towards zero. The neighbors emerged from Elizabeth's cabin like survivors of a shipwreck. They stumbled back to their own homes, empty and cold, and began the work of rebuilding, repairing, surviving. William Garrett returned to his cabin and stood in the main room, looking at the solid plank walls that had almost killed his family. He put his hand against the wood and felt the cold radiating inward from the outside, felt the truth of it. Solid was not strong. Solid was not warm. Solid was a lie. He tore the cabin down that spring. By June of 1887, 5 families in the Boulder River Valley had rebuilt their homes using Elizabeth Anderson's method. Double walls, pine needles, sawdust, moss, anything that would trap air. Captain Thornton visited Elizabeth in July. He stood in her doorway, hat in hand, and asked permission to measure her walls, to document her technique. "Why?" Elizabeth asked. "Because I was wrong," he said. "And because soldiers are dying in barracks I designed. I want to fix that." She let him in. He spent the afternoon measuring, sketching, asking questions. He took notes in a small leather journal, his handwriting neat and precise. "This should be standard," he said finally. "Every building on the frontier should use this method. It is cheaper, more effective, and it saves lives." "Then teach people," Elizabeth said. He did. By 1890, the double wall method with insulating fill was common across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Settlers called it the Swedish method, though Elizabeth always said it was older than that. It was Sami wisdom. It was Russian wisdom. It was the wisdom of people who had lived in cold places for thousands of years and learned to work with nature instead of against it. Modern architects call it cavity wall insulation. They measure it in R values and thermal resistance. They use fiberglass instead of pine needles, foam instead of sawdust, but the principle is the same. Trap air, stop conduction, hold heat. Elizabeth Anderson did not invent it. She just remembered it when everyone else had forgotten. Elizabeth lived in that cabin for 32 years. She raised her daughters there. She saw them married. She saw grandchildren born. And every winter, when the temperature dropped and the wind howled, her home stayed warm. She died in 1919, at the age of 73, in her sleep, in the cabin she built with her own hands. The cabin still stands today, preserved as a historic site by the Montana Historical Society. You can visit it. You can walk through the door and see the walls, still packed with pine needles after more than a century. You can stand in the center of the room and imagine what it must have felt like to be warm when everyone else was freezing. To be right when everyone else said you were wrong. The plaque outside the door tells her story in simple words. But it misses the most important part. Elizabeth Anderson did not win because she was lucky. She did not win because she was stubborn. She won because she understood something the educated men did not. She understood that wisdom is not about degrees or titles or experience building barracks for the army. Wisdom is about listening to the people who survived. The people who lived in the cold and figured out how to beat it with nothing but trash and determination. She understood that nature does not care about your pride. It does not care if you are an engineer or a pastor or a successful cattleman. It only cares if you are smart enough to work with it instead of against it. And she understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon you can have is the willingness to be called a fool by people who are about to freeze to death in their expensive, solid, respectable homes. History is written by the survivors, and often the survivors are the ones who dared to think differently. If this story of resilience inspired you, like this video and share it with someone who appreciates the old ways. Because the old ways, the forgotten ways, the ways that people like Elizabeth Anderson carried across oceans and mountains and storms, those ways saved lives, and they still can